personally thrilled that you all decided to come here, spend time with Archaeology Southwest, and hear from Dr. Martin Welker. Martin has been at all of these presentations through this dog series, but I don't know him very well. And as many of you all know, what I like to do is not give standard academic introductions of people, because you can find that out on the internet. So I oftentimes will go and ask people, what is it about you that's interesting that other folks in the audience may not know? So a couple of things about Dr. Welker. He's been at the Arizona State Museum since 2019. He's submitted his tenure packet this year. It's out there being considered right now as we speak, so round of applause for that accomplishment. He doesn't have tenure yet, however. There are a number of faculty from the University of Arizona Anthro Department and the museum, emeritus and active. Bribery and extortion checks can go to Dr. Kuhn and Steiner and Ferguson and Mills and Parizo and Odegaard and so on. The best of luck to you, Martin. It's a big deal to get that packet in, and hopefully it'll all turn out the way that we think it will, right? Dr. Welker was also just described to me as an onion. You peel back the layers and you learn something new about that guy. That's cool. He studies dogs, but he owns cats, all right? Something going on there. And they're not going to like this, and that's okay. But Martin's parents are in the back over there. Dennis and Joanne Welker, who are in the back there. Come on. Hands up. There they are. Parents are responsible for so many accomplishments. I can't attest to this because my twins are 17. I'm responsible for none of that stuff, okay? It's just not happening. But you can't make this stuff up, folks. Dennis and Joanne have PhDs in biology and genetics, and they volunteer in this guy's lab. So how cool is that, right? I mean, that's a pretty neat thing to have your parents come in and volunteer. So we're not going to hear about cats tonight, I don't think, unless it's comparative biology. No, we're not. Anyway, folks, thank you again for being here. It's been a heavy-duty couple of months, specifically last few weeks. Archaeology Southwest is doing fine. We still need your help politically, socially, economically, financially, all the rest of that kind of stuff. But let's take a moment to breathe and enjoy some really cool scholarship from Martin Welker. Thanks, y'all.
All right. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. We're going to talk about sled dogs here in the Southwest. I know you're probably all thinking, we don't have a lot of snow here. We probably don't have sledding either, right? Well, I'm going to concede the point. We don't have Arctic-style sledding here in the Southwest. But I'm going to encourage you to think more broadly as sledding as a category of using dogs to transport things. And this is a question that has been talked about at times in the Southwest, and that's kind of what we're going to get into. But before I do that, I'm just going to briefly outline how I'm going to structure the talk. The first set of slides is going to be background to get you up to date, up to speed on how dogs are being used to transport things in the Americas and how that relates to the Southwest. And then I'm going to give you a brief proof of concept study to show you how one might go about identifying transport dogs in the Americas. And then we'll get to the Southwest. So we've got some catching up to do before we get to the Southwest case study. So, transport dogs. In the Americas, at the time of European contact, there were already 3 forms of transport technology in the Americas that relied on dogs. Arctic sledding, which is the one you're probably all thinking of, you can see on this map is sort of restricted to the Arctic. It's up there in the far northern regions of North America, and that's these horizontal black bars on the chart. There is also something called a travois, which is this. It's essentially a single dog sled, if you will. It's 2 poles that are tied to the dog with a platform behind the dog that you load up and the dog pulls it along. 1 dog per sled. This is primarily found on the Great Plains and Canadian prairies. We know that they were being used. There's lots of ethnographic and historic descriptions of these. And then the final transport technology is something you're probably also familiar with. They're popular today. You can buy these little side packs that you strap onto your dog. There was a form of this here in the Americas in the past as well, and that's the polka dots on the map. So you can see that it's pretty widely distributed north to south. It occurs in regions where the travois was being used, but also up in the Arctic. In the Arctic, it is reportedly used primarily in the summer when the snow and ice had melted and you maybe weren't using a sled. You would transition to using packs instead. And for our purposes here in the Southwest, what we're primarily talking about is these two technologies, the travois and the packs, which you can see are kind of used around the Southwest, even if ethnographic and historic observations don't necessarily report their use here right away, right? So we know that they're being used historically when Europeans get here because there are a lot of ethnographic and historic observations and descriptions of these. On this chart, I'm representing that with this little gray box. That's basically the time period when European observers are making those accounts that we have. But there really isn't a deep archaeological record of any of these things. There is archaeological evidence for sleds in the Americas that dates back to 1,000, maybe 1,500 years ago. But we suspect, and a lot of evidence is supporting this, that dog sleds, the technology, the dogs that were used in sledding, is introduced from Siberia right around that time period. And if you go to Siberia, sledding technology seems to go back another 500,000 years there. And then evidence for it sort of peters out as well. There's one case that may exist that's about 9,000 years old. It's an island in Siberia called Zhukov Island, where there are what are interpreted as sled fragments and lots of dogs on a single site. And it's been argued that it's sledding. It is a little bit suspicious that there's a 7,000-year gap between that and the next really clear evidence for sledding, but it's been argued. But for our case, the travois and the packs, because both of them are made of plant material and leather, wood and leather, or potentially plant fiber that's being made into rope or threads, we don't really have a lot of archaeological data. It just doesn't exist, either because preservation is bad or because it's not where we're looking. And in the case of at least some of these things, the travois, they may actually be multifunctional items, as in we've got poles that are being used for the travois when they're transporting it, but when they set up camp, the poles get used for something else. And so the pieces might not be immediately recognizable as transport technology. Now, this doesn't mean that people haven't hypothesized about when and where people were using transport technology. There are at least 3 hypotheses for travois transport, or when it may have been developed. One of these suggests it's about 1,100 years ago. The argument here is that some people think there's a shift in the size of teepees, the diameter of the teepee based on rings of stones that show up on sites in the plains. They're used to hold down the teepee cover when it's set up. The argument being that if you have a larger diameter teepee, it requires more bison hides to make it. Bison hides are really heavy, and by extension, it would be very nice to have a dog to transport that heavy bison hide teepee cover. The problem is not everybody agrees that there's a change in the size of the teepee rings, and so maybe there isn't a change at all. The next hypothesis that I've shown up here suggests that this technology is developed at like 1,500 to 3,500 years ago. But again, it's really based on the fact that things like ceramics start showing up on some plains assemblages at this time, and the argument once again is, well, those things might be really heavy, so it'd be nice if there was a dog to transport them. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing it, though. This brings us to the third hypothesis, which is that it dates to something like 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. And this is based on what some people have interpreted as injuries to the dog's skeleton that may have been accumulated through doing things like transporting stuff. And specifically, they're talking about something observed on the vertebra, which is what I'm demonstrating here. You can see how this process of bone that sticks out of the top of the vertebra is curving slightly to one side. The argument that's been made is that this curvature is the result of having a very heavy weight pressing down on the top of the vertebra and forcing the bone out of alignment. Now, it sounds great. Unfortunately, there have been 2 big studies published on coyotes and dogs and sled dogs and wolves and non-sledding dogs. And, well, they all have this, whether they've been used to transport stuff or not. So really, we don't have a solid archaeological record for any of these things, which makes it somewhat tricky to study them, right? Now, there are other sources of evidence. One of these is some experimental data. I'm very jealous of this study. A fellow by the name of Norman Henderson decided that he was going to recreate travois transport as an experiment, and he took his dog, Serge, and he built a little travois, and then he spent several weeks basically wandering around on the Canadian prairies in Saskatchewan, testing how much Serge could haul and how far he could go. And he found a number of very interesting and important things, one of which is that if you're going fairly short distances, like a mile or 2, he can haul 107% of his body mass, which is pretty good. He's not going very fast. He's going the same speed that a person walking is, but he's hauling a significant load. Unfortunately, if you're going any further than that, you really need to reduce the load down to like 40 or 50% of his body mass. Otherwise, he's going to get tired and want to take a break, and then you're going to end up taking a break, and you're not going to make a whole lot of distance. So you may have to decide how you're going to load up the dog when you're transporting stuff. Now, Henderson also found some very important, I think, characteristics about the landscape that really determine whether or not transport technology will work. Landscape is very important. If you are anywhere steep, mountains, valleys, anything like that, doesn't work. If you're going uphill and you load your dog up with 107% of his body mass, he's not climbing that hill. If you're going downhill and you put 107% of your dog's body mass behind them on a sled, it's going to roll right over them and you'll have a nice dog-shaped pancake, and the load will be at the bottom of the hill. Similarly, if you are somewhere with a lot of brush or trees or rocks, anything that your travois can get snagged on, it will. And you will spend a lot of time disentangling your travois from anything in the landscape, which will slow you down immensely. You also can't go through bodies of water. If you put a big heavy load of stuff on a sled and you attach it to your dog, they cannot doggy paddle fast enough to cross the river. They will sink. And then most importantly for us here in the Southwest, heat is a big problem. Dogs don't have sweat glands. They can't cool off efficiently. If you ask your dog to haul a lot of stuff around in the heat, they will get heat exhaustion and die. So, basically, you need flat, grassy conditions with very little topography and very little water to cross, preferably in like fall, winter, spring when it's not really hot out, right? Now, I want you guys to keep this in mind as we move towards the Southwest. It's very important. But first, I want to give you a brief proof of concept. You may be thinking we don't have an archaeological record of any of these kinds of transport technologies. How do we actually go about studying dogs as transport? Well, I'm going to argue that the way we do this is we actually look at the dogs. We don't look for the transport technology, we look for the dogs themselves. The reason I'm going to argue this is that the physical characteristics of dogs are usually or often very strongly connected to the roles that they play in human society. We've taken something that was initially basically a gray wolf, and we have adapted them to very specialized purposes within human societies, often to a degree that we don't see in many other domesticates. And I can give you a very simple, quick example of this that makes it very clear. If I were to tell you that I'm going to go sledding, and we're going to go out in the parking lot and go dog sledding, and we get out there, and the sled's all hooked up, and on the front of that sled are sausage dogs, you're going to look at me like I'm an idiot, right? Because sausage dogs are not going to pull me around on a sled, and they're also not going to haul around a lot of cargo. So probably not suitable to the role of sled dogs. The same is true if I tell you that we're going to go herd sheep in the parking lot and we get out there and I've got a sausage dog there too, right? Sheep are going to run right over the sausage dog and it's not going to be very efficient. Sausage dogs are really good at hunting badgers. You send them down a badger hole, they're much better at that than they are at any of these other roles, right? Well, it just so happens that the same is probably true of dogs used in transport. There are probably specific characteristics that make them adapted to that purpose. And we can look at the ethnographic record to try and figure out what these are. We know from ethnographic documents on the plains that groups that use dogs to transport stuff are often really mobile. They're moving around on the landscape quite a lot, which is why they have adopted dogs to this role, right? If you need to move a lot of stuff around on the landscape, the more you're doing it, the more efficient and effective having a dog to help you transport that stuff is going to be. On the plains, these groups are moving like 10 to 40 times per year. That means packing up their entire settlement, moving it somewhere else, setting it back up. Some of these families have between 2 and 6 dogs per household. These dogs are reportedly transporting between 50 and 100 pounds each on a travois, and between 30 and 70 pounds in those little side packs. So they are transporting a lot of cargo, a lot of weight. If you have 6 dogs and each of them is transporting 100 pounds, you can transport 600 pounds worth of stuff just with the dogs. But I think most importantly for our case, they are practicing selection on the dogs. They are breeding them. They are culling small pups out of litters. They are castrating male dogs that they don't want participating in the next gene pool, the next generation, right? They are doing this specifically because they want big dogs. The bigger your dog, the more it can transport, right? So they are selecting for size, strength, and endurance in the dog population itself, which suggests to me that size is potentially a really key characteristic. If we can identify changes in dog size between regions or through time, that might be indicative of when and where dogs are being used to transport stuff. So, how do I go about doing this? Well, I first go and I find dog bones and assemblages. I collect some measurements and I compare them to modern dog specimens through a series of mathematical equations that allow me to estimate things like shoulder height, how tall the dogs are, body mass, how much they weigh, things like this that will allow me to get some sense of what those dogs looked like in the past. And when I do this, this is what I see. So here I have compiled body mass estimates on over 1,000 dogs in North America, archaeological dogs in North America. And I've grouped them by region using that same map that you guys saw earlier. And you'll notice that there are 5 regions over here on the left-hand side of the chart where you have dogs that are higher up the chart. The higher you are, the bigger the dog is. We're talking about body mass, how much the dog weighs effectively. So these 5 regions happen to be the 5 regions in North America where we have ethnographic or historic observations of people using dogs to transport stuff. This horizontal line here, that is the minimum body mass you need, based on Henderson's experiment, to transport 50 pounds worth of stuff. Do you see many dogs crossing that boundary in the rest of these regions? There aren't very many, right? It just so happens that these 6 dogs, they all come from contexts that may or may not really be as old as they were initially argued. They may actually be quite recent. In fact, these may be dogs that were brought over by the Europeans that ended up on a site somewhere and were misinterpreted originally. These aren't transport dogs. They're probably pets that ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, we can also plot these data through time, and I know this is a very messy chart, but 0 today is up here, and 10,000 years ago is over there. When we plot body mass in the same way, here's your horizontal line, minimum body mass required for 50 pounds worth of cargo transport. You'll notice that we don't really have a lot of these filled in dark dots crossing that line until about here, sort of 3,000-ish years ago. This is suggesting, at least I'm taking it to suggest to me, that maybe dog-based transport technology like travois and packing might date to about 3,000 years ago based on dog body mass. It suggests that it's not really occurring too much older than that. There may be some. It may have taken some time for dogs to be adapted to this role, but it seems like, at least based on the data we have, dog-based transport may date to like 3,000-ish years ago, which is cool in and of itself. If sledding comes over from Asia at 1,500, that indicates that there's probably independent developments of dog-based technology in the New World. Pretty cool. Okay, now you're all up to speed. So now we're to the question, are there dogs in the Southwest being used for transport? Well, let's revisit that chart with the dog body mass on it. Do they look very big? They look pretty small, right? So my initial thought when I approached this question was, they don't really seem big enough. But maybe I'm wrong. We'll take it and keep investigating. But then there's the problem of the environment. I don't know about you, but the summer here seems problematic, right? If heat is a problem, 100-degree summers that last a third of the year, it's probably not great for dogs transporting stuff. But maybe that's just the Sonoran Desert, which admittedly has lots of prickly, spiny plants that are going to snag that travois, so that doesn't seem right. Northern New Mexico doesn't seem right either. I don't know if you guys have been up there, but there's lots of mountains and valleys and stuff like that. So that seems like an issue. There are areas, maybe eastern New Mexico, that are maybe flatter, kind of coming off the plains. That might be better. It might also be that dogs are only being used to transport stuff in the winter at certain places. So there's possibilities, but on the front end, it seems a little bit problematic, right? So here's what I think happened. I think this is a theoretical issue that was taken too literally. Dogs in the Southwest were initially described by a guy named Glover Allen, who wrote this volume, Dogs of the American Aborigines, in 1920. And in this volume, he argued that there were sort of two size classes. There are small dogs, which he called Tachichi, and there are larger dogs, which he broke into two breeds, essentially. One being Plains Indian dogs, and one being long-haired Pueblo dogs. Now, Allen only looked at, I'm going to estimate about 30 or 40 specimens from all of North and South America when making his classifications. So he wasn't exhaustive in his data set. And you can see that analysts who came after Allen, many of them just break this into small and large dogs. They don't bother trying to fit them specifically into his groupings. Barbara Lawrence is an exception, largely because she trained with Glover Allen and worked with him in Harvard. So she tends to use his classifications, although I've never actually seen her use long-haired Pueblo dogs in any of her publications. She just refers to Plains Indian dogs. But if we take this and we sort of fast forward through time, we'll briefly just talk about the breeds themselves. So Allen provides a really good description of the Tachichi, detailed. They're small, terrier-sized, light-limbed dogs of slender proportions, probably very similar to these two in the front. Excellent specimens if you need a visual. And you'll notice that he even goes as far as erect ears and well-developed tails and coat colors. He's able to do this because there are some dog mummies that he's looked at and was able to come up with some of these characteristics. Now, when we go to the large dog breeds, he's much less specific. The Plains Indian dog is described as a coyote-like, medium in size dog with erect ears, a drooping tail, and a rough coat. And the long-haired Pueblo dog is described simply as probably a local breed of the Plains Indian dog with a longer coat, right? So he's much less specific. And if we fast forward a little bit, the really big analysis of dogs that takes place in the Southwest is done by a fellow by the name of Harold Colton. There's archaeologists in the room who study ceramics. This is the guy who came up with your ceramic typologies, or some of them. I'm going to claim him, though, because his degree was in zoology. Just saying. He's not an archaeologist. He's not a ceramicist, even. But Colton looked at 198 dog remains, skeletons, from the Southwest, and tried to kind of fit them into Allen's categories. He did, however, only use small and large as his groupings. And what he found is that there are two statistically different groups. There are small dogs and there are big dogs. The small dogs seem to be present throughout his sample. They're present early on, they're present later in time, they're always there. However, the larger dogs are limited to sort of 900 AD and later. There aren't any of them earlier in time. And here's where I think Colton made a somewhat critical error in thinking. The idea that the large dogs were Plains Indian dogs is sort of baked into the literature at this point. And so Colton felt forced to identify them as Plains Indian dogs and explain their presence later in time in that lens, right? Through the lens of them being Plains Indian dogs. And at this point, we knew that dogs on the plains were being used to transport stuff. So if these are large dogs and they're present in the Southwest, and Allen has already told us that the large dogs are the Plains Indian dogs, by extension, they are transport dogs, right? So Colton argues that the large dogs showing up later in time represent one of two things. They are either indicative of increased trade contact between the Southwest and the plains, sort of bison hides and things like that coming off the plains, and maize and ceramics and things following them back onto the plains, or these dogs are indicative of the arrival of Athabascan groups like the Navajo and the Apache. 900 AD seems a little bit early for that based on current data. Maybe it reflects trade networks, but either way, Colton was sort of led into the assumption that they are large dogs, and large dogs are transport animals. Now, a grad student and I went and revisited Colton's data set. We got his original data. It was in the archives at the Museum of Northern Arizona. We added some data to it. We reran all of his tests. We still get 2 groupings. So we think he's correct on this point. You can see here we're using 3 different ways of evaluating whether there are 2 groups of dogs. This is the length of the skull. You can see that there's 1 group and a second group. This is shoulder height. There's still 2 groupings. This is body mass. There's still 2 groupings, right? So we agree. There are 2 groups of dogs here in the Southwest. We plot them out on a timeline, just like I've shown you before. And the large dogs are boxed here in red. And it just so happens that that is roughly 800 or 980 and later. They don't seem to be showing up in the earlier time period. So yes, we agree with Colton's assessment that they are later in time. The problem really is that the dogs themselves are just not very big. These dogs, the large Pueblo period dogs, average about 16.5 kilos, which is about 35 pounds. That's roughly the size of a Cocker Spaniel. These are dogs from the plains. You can see that they get significantly larger, right? If I take Henderson's experiment and I try and calculate load capacity, how much these dogs could transport, over short distances, we're talking like 40 pounds. Over longer distances, we're really talking 10 to 15 pounds of stuff. Is a dog transporting 10 to 15 pounds of stuff really a transport dog? Are they going to put in the effort to build a travois and train the dogs to use them for 10 to 15 pounds of stuff to transport? If you have to come all the way off the plains with those trade goods, that seems like a long way to go, right? So we decided to take this one step further. There's a recent master's student at the University of Saskatchewan who actually went and looked at sled dog skeletons, specifically at the sites on the skeleton where the muscles attach. And if you're a sled dog and you're involved in habitual sledding, lots of exercise and loading, stress placed on the skeleton, the muscle attachment sites actually become really pronounced and rough in order to give the muscle something to latch onto. She also compared them, though, to wolves and coyotes and dogs that weren't used in sledding, and their muscle attachment sites look like this. And in my lab, we looked at 132 bones from dogs from the Southwest, and our muscle attachment sites look like this. We don't have any that look like the sled dogs. So this seems to undermine, yet again, this idea that they're transport dogs. It's possible that travois or pack transport could look different, but it's still loading the skeleton up. And if they're doing this a lot, I would still expect muscle attachment sites to develop more and be more pronounced. So once again, this seems inconsistent with dogs being used to transport stuff. So we've also tracked down a bunch of the specimens Colton looked at and identified as large transport dogs. And in my opinion, at least 5 of them are actually coyotes. Their skeletal morphology is similar to dogs, but they're not quite the same. They're more slender and gracile, and they look more like coyotes to me. Now, we are working on a statistical model that will take specific measurements and characteristics on the skeleton and give us probabilities that this is the case. But there were only ever 19 large dogs in Colton's data set, and if I think 5 of them are already coyotes, I still haven't found all of them, but I'm becoming less and less convinced that these are transport dogs. There's also ADNA evidence. If you remember our very first talk in this series, some of these are coyotes for sure because they've been genetically tested and they are actually coyotes. So my answer to the question of whether there are transport dogs in the Southwest is I'm not convinced. You may be wondering how we've got it so wrong. Well, I show this slide to every group, and I ask the same question. This is a selection of modern skulls from my lab. By show of hands, how many of you think that these are all domestic dogs? Nobody. How many of you think they're all wild canids? We've got a couple. How many of you think this is a mix? The majority. Interesting. When I show this in class on campus, the students always think I'm trying to trick them. It's all wild canids. This is a mix. It is a mix. There are some wolves. This one's a wolf for sure. There are a couple of coyotes. These are coyotes, I believe. There is a jackal. There's an Australian dingo. There's some domestic dogs. There's some foxes down in this group. This one is actually a hyena. Hyenas are more closely related to cats than they are to dogs. But the point of this slide is that the skeletal morphology of these animals is pretty similar. And if you're not really careful, you can easily mistake one for the other. In fact, I recently did an analysis of over 200, close to 300 papers where they identified domestic dogs, and I simply marked down what method they reported using. And a lot of them either tell you nothing, which is problematic, or they tell you that the primary feature they used was that there were a number of bones that were all together, and that must be a burial. And people would never bury anything except a domestic dog. So by extension, those were domestic dogs. May be true. I'm less convinced than I would like to be. We've been working in my lab on trying to remedy this situation by identifying characteristics that really do work and testing characteristics that people report using. But I think the issue is misidentifications, at least in the Southwest. So I want to conclude. Were there transport dogs in the Southwest? I don't think I've seen one yet. And I've looked at about 300 specimens from the Southwest so far. Admittedly, many of them are from Arizona and western New Mexico, so maybe there are transport dogs further east. I haven't seen them yet, though. I think what happened is we do definitely have the little dogs. And if you remember Lori Webster's presentation of a couple of months ago, these are probably the dog hair textile dogs. I'm not sure this distinction exists. I'm not sure there are Plains Indian dogs and long-haired Pueblo dogs. They may all be coyotes. There may be larger dogs in the Southwest. I think we need to do more work to separate the ones that are actually dogs from the coyotes, if there are any. And even then, they seem a little bit small for transport dogs. So for those of you wondering what the load capacity of your little terrier-sized dog is, it's a bit on the small side. They're probably not being used for transport either. And with that, I'm going to thank all of the many people who have helped me with this project, and I will happily take questions.
Thank you so much. We have a question over here.
Yeah, I'm thinking of your size distribution for the Plains dogs.
Yeah.
And at the top end, you have the larger dogs, and you have kind of an ethnographic reference for those being transport dogs.
Yep.
What does the ethnographic record tell you was the purpose of the other half of the distribution, the small
These
dogs?
ones?
Yeah.
They don't really get mentioned that much.
Maybe guard
They're
dogs or?
there. Some of these groups do eat dogs, so they may be eaten. They're probably hunting with them. Sometimes they get talked about in terms of kind of providing like an alarm system. Yeah. They don't get mentioned nearly as often as the big dogs, though.
Are pack dogs and other dogs, are they fed differently historically? Would that show up in isotopes or anything?
Isotopically, I don't think we have enough data yet. Ethnographically, it seems like dogs aren't being fed unless they are participating in transport, and then primarily during the days when they're actually doing the transport. Otherwise, it seems like many of these dogs are kind of left to fend for themselves. They eat whatever's around. They hunt things around the camp. They clean up scraps. They eat whatever people leave behind. But they aren't being intentionally provisioned for the most part.
During my study at NEU for the Athabascan groups, they are seasonally migrating groups, and they did bring with them dogs. So my question is, wouldn't it make sense that if it's just a few pack of dogs, maybe it wouldn't do them any justice, but what if they had dozens of them to help carry the load? Mostly human beings did carry the load, but what if there was a dozen dogs that would help them carry the load?
You mean little dogs?
Little
or
dogs. Yeah.
It's possible. The thing is, the only accounts that we have in the Southwest are sort of brief observations of dogs that seem to be involved in sort of plains contact, trade of stuff. We know that there's trade going on between the southern plains and the Southwest, and that seems to be where most of the connectivity between the dogs and transport is going on. We don't have a lot of observations of dogs in the Southwest by modern groups that are here using dogs for this. We have lots of descriptions of the dog hair textiles. We've got archaeological examples of the dog hair textiles, but we, even in the Southwest, don't have the pack technology and stuff like that, really good examples of it. There's some, but not a lot. And even then, it might not be dogs. It might be used for something else.
What mention is made in oral tradition or regarding dogs in the Southwest? How are they described, and are there legends in which they appear?
In terms of the transport dogs? Or
Yes.
in terms of dogs broadly?
Dogs broadly.
I'm not a specialist in the Southwest tradition specifically, but they talk about the dogs on sites. By the time the Europeans got here, the dog's hair wasn't really being used to make the textiles anymore, so they aren't talking about that. They do talk about dogs around villages. White dogs in particular seem to be highly valued. Barbara, you are a Southwestern archaeologist. Am I missing something on Southwestern dogs? Yeah. They kind of get mentioned, but it's mostly in passing. There aren't like really detailed accounts of dogs, which I think adds to the case that they aren't really being used in like transport roles, because everywhere that they are being used for that, they get really intensively mentioned and discussed, and everybody talks about them. So the fact that they only show up kind of in passing in the Southwest, to me, suggests that they aren't being used for that, at least when European observers are around, which is admittedly a bias in the record. We could be missing something entirely, but they aren't heavily discussed beyond them being around.
I think the slide you showed that showed the differences in topography is a big factor. But if you look at all of North America, where sled dogs and heavy use of pack dogs occur, it pretty much coincides with the distribution of salmon. And salmon are a really rich, fairly easy to obtain food source for the dogs. There's good ethnographic evidence from North America and northern Arctic area, and some contemporary studies too, with people who are still using sled dogs for hunting purposes. So there might be some clues there about calorie requirements to keep a team going for a period of time.
Isotopic data from the Pacific Northwest in particular suggests that dogs are eating a lot of fish. But the plains is probably bison meat that they're getting if they're being provisioned, because they are mentioned in transport of bison meat from carcasses in particular. And then up in the Arctic, I know that there are accounts of them being fed things like seal fat and stuff like that, especially when they're being used for sledding.
Yeah, I saw in the news recently some imprints from, what do you call it when you use the two pieces of timber?
A travois.
Yeah, and they just recently found these imprints and were following them and showing, and it was fairly old.
You're talking about the white sand stuff in New Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the argument that's being made there is that it's people hauling the travois. It's not dogs, because there are human footprints in the trackway with the sticks, the poles, and they don't have any dog footprints. People have argued that early Paleo-Indian groups were using dogs to transport stuff. I've yet to see any archaeological data to support the idea. I think it's a theoretical idea, but I haven't seen any archaeological data.
Well, thank you all very much. Let's give another round of applause for Martin Welker.